I've always been the quiet one in my family, the one who kept her head down and followed the rules while everyone else clamored for attention. I grew up in a whirlwind of noise, my parents' voices dominating the house as they navigated the chaos of raising 3 kids in a cramped apartment. But amidst all that, it was clear that I was never their priority. My siblings, particularly my younger cousin Olivia, seemed to shine brighter in their eyes. Olivia wasn't just the golden child, she was the kind of person who drew people to her like a magnet. Her infectious laugh, boundless energy, and ability to charm her way out of any situation made her the center of attention. Meanwhile, I was the one who blended into the background, reliable and easy to overlook. As I got older, I leaned into that invisibility, determined to carve out a space for myself far away from my family's chaos. I worked hard, taking on extra shifts and odd jobs through high school and college, saving every penny I could. By the time I turned 30, I'd done what no one in my family thought I could do. I bought my own home. It wasn't a mansion by any stretch of the imagination, but it was mine. A cozy 2-bedroom house on the edge of town with enough space for me to finally breathe. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and the furniture was a mix of secondhand finds and pieces I'd carefully saved for over the years. It wasn't fancy, but it was a reflection of me, quiet, sturdy, and determined. Despite all this, my parents never stopped seeing me as the responsible one, the one they could count on to pick up the slack when others faltered. And falter, Olivia did. She dropped out of college after 2 semesters, bounced between jobs, and moved back in with my parents more times than I could count. Each time, they called it a temporary setback, but it never felt temporary. Still, I kept my distance, limiting my involvement to obligatory family gatherings and the occasional phone call. But even from the outskirts, I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing on me. My parents had a way of turning their problems into my problems, guilt-tripping me into helping out when I tried to say no. "Family is all we have," my mother would say, her voice thick with disappointment. "But you have your own space now," my father would chime in, as if my hard-earned home was somehow fair game for their schemes. And yet, I held firm. For years, I'd put my own needs aside for the sake of family, sacrificing my time, energy, and even money to keep the peace. But not anymore. My house was my sanctuary, a boundary they couldn't cross. At least, that's what I thought until the day they showed up on my doorstep. It was a Saturday morning, and I'd been savoring the rare luxury of a quiet breakfast when I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. I peeked through the curtains and felt my stomach drop. My parents were here, and they weren't alone. Olivia stepped out of the car, her hand resting on a small but noticeable baby bump. My parents flanked her on either side, carrying a couple of suitcases and a bag of what looked like baby supplies. I opened the door before they could knock, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Hi, sweetie," my mother said brightly, stepping forward to plant a kiss on my cheek. "We've got wonderful news." Olivia shuffled awkwardly behind her, avoiding my eyes. My father cleared his throat and said, "Your cousin's in a bit of a situation, and we thought you'd be the perfect person to help her out." I froze, already sensing where this was going. "She needs a place to stay," my mother continued, her tone cheerful and rehearsed. "Just for a little while. You've got that lovely spare room, and it would mean so much to her and to us if you could open your home to her during this time." I glanced at Olivia, whose face was a mixture of embarrassment and entitlement, like she knew this was a ridiculous ask, but also believed she deserved it. "Mom," I said slowly, "you can't be serious." But the look in her eyes told me that she was. And suddenly, the sanctuary I'd worked so hard to build didn't feel so secure anymore. I stood in the doorway, trying to process what I'd just heard. My parents stood there, cheerful and expectant, as though they hadn't just asked me to upend my life. Olivia, meanwhile, was carefully avoiding my gaze, her hands cradling her small bump as if it were her ticket to a better life. "You can't be serious," I repeated, my voice sharper this time. "Oh, come on, sweetie," my mother said, her tone dipping into that familiar mix of guilt and condescension. "It's not like you're using the spare room for anything important." I resisted the urge to snap back. "That's not the point. This is my home." "And we're family," my father interjected, his deep voice carrying the weight of unspoken obligation. "Family helps each other out." I looked at Olivia, hoping she might jump in to defend me, to say this wasn't necessary. Instead, she shifted awkwardly on her feet, then glanced at my parents for support. "I really don't want to be a burden," she said softly, but her words rang hollow. "If you didn't want to be a burden, you wouldn't be here," I thought bitterly, but didn't say. "You don't have to decide right now," my mother said, reaching out to pat my arm. "We can come in, have some tea, and talk it through." "No," I said firmly, stepping back and blocking the doorway. The word came out sharper than I intended, but it felt good to say it. "This isn't something I need to think about. The answer is no." My mother's face hardened, the faux cheerfulness giving way to thinly veiled irritation. "You're being unreasonable. Olivia is going through a tough time. She's pregnant and alone. How can you turn your back on her like this?" "She's not alone," I said, pointing toward them. "She has you two. She has other options. I'm not one of them." "We're too old to have a baby in the house again," my father snapped. "Your home is perfect for her. It's quiet, safe, and close to the hospital, and you have no one else to take care of." "Exactly," I interrupted. "I have no one else to take care of, and I like it that way. I've spent my whole life putting my family first, and now I'm putting myself first. That doesn't make me the bad guy." Olivia finally spoke up, her voice small but tinged with frustration. "I didn't ask for this, you know. I didn't ask to end up in this situation. I thought you'd be more understanding." Her words hit a nerve, and I turned to face her fully. "You're right, you didn't ask for this. But I didn't ask for you to show up on my doorstep and expect me to give up my space either. Life is hard for everyone, Olivia. I worked my ass off for this house, and I won't let you guilt me into giving it up." For a moment, there was silence. My parents exchanged a look, and I could tell they weren't used to hearing me stand my ground like this. "Fine," my mother said, her tone icy. "If that's how you feel, we won't bother you anymore." She grabbed one of Olivia's bags and turned toward the car. My father followed, his face red with anger. Olivia hesitated, looking at me as though she wanted to say something, but then she turned and followed them. I watched as they drove away, my stomach churning with a mix of guilt and frustration. I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't over. I knew my parents well enough to know they wouldn't give up this easily. It didn't take long for my parents to regroup and come back swinging. By Monday evening, the calls began. The first was from my mother. "Sweetie," she said, her tone sugar-coated, "I just wanted to apologize for the other day. We didn't mean to overwhelm you. We just thought Olivia staying with you would be the best solution for everyone. You're so independent, and she really needs a role model right now." Her words felt like tiny needles pricking my skin. "Mom, I already said no. I'm not changing my mind." "But she's family," my mother said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Don't you think we've done enough for her? We've been putting her up for months now, and she's struggling, honey. If you just gave her a chance." "I gave you my answer," I said, cutting her off. "I don't owe Olivia my home, and I'm not responsible for her choices." I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling. By Tuesday, my father tried a different tactic. His voice was calm but firm, the kind he used when delivering lectures that left no room for argument. "You're being selfish," he said, not even bothering with a greeting. "Selfish?" I said, my blood boiling. "How is it selfish to want to live in my own house without someone barging in?" "You've got 2 bedrooms, and it's just you living there," he said, as if the math alone justified his demand. "You're sitting on all that space while Olivia is stuck in that tiny room at our place, pregnant and stressed out. Do you even care about your cousin?" I bit my lip, the frustration bubbling over. Of course I care, but I've done more than enough for this family over the years. You've always expected me to clean up everyone else's messes while putting my own needs last. I'm done being the fallback plan. His silence was heavy, but I didn't wait for him to respond. Goodbye, Dad. I hung up again, the guilt threatening to crawl its way into my resolve. Wednesday brought a more creative approach, the family group chat. Can you believe it? My aunt chimed in first, her passive-aggressive text dripping with judgment. All that space and no compassion. Poor Olivia deserves better. She doesn't owe anyone her house, one of my cousins replied, defending me. It was a small comfort to know not everyone was on their side. The argument exploded from there, with half the family taking Olivia's side and the other half cautiously trying to stay neutral. My phone buzzed nonstop for hours until I finally muted the chat and put it face down on the counter. I thought I'd seen the worst of it, but the real escalation came on Thursday. I was heading home from work when I noticed a car parked in my driveway. My stomach sank when I saw Olivia sitting on my front steps, a duffel bag at her feet. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I approached. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "Aunt Karen said you'd come around if I just showed up. I can't stay at your parents' place anymore. They're so upset all the time, and it's stressing me out." I felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on me, but I refused to let it break me. "Olivia, I told them, and I'm telling you now, this isn't going to work. You can't just show up and expect me to take you in." Her face twisted into a pout. "You're seriously going to leave me out here pregnant and alone? What kind of person does that?" I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. "You can't guilt me into this. I've spent my whole life putting my family's needs ahead of mine, and I'm done. This house is my boundary, and I won't let you or anyone else cross it." "You're unbelievable," she snapped, standing up and grabbing her bag. "You think you're better than the rest of us, just because you have a house? Good luck finding anyone to help you when you're the one who needs it." I let her words hang in the air as I unlocked my door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind me. That night, my mother called again, furious. "How could you turn Olivia away like that?" she shouted. "She's pregnant, for God's sake!" "I'm not heartless, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "But you've spent my entire life expecting me to give up everything for the sake of this family. This time, the answer is no." "You're going to regret this," she said coldly before hanging up. The next few days were tense, but they left me alone. I thought the storm had passed until Sunday morning, when my parents showed up at my door unannounced, this time with more relatives in tow. "You don't get to shut us out," my father declared as they crowded my front porch. "This is a family matter, and we're going to settle it today." But I was ready. I stood tall, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. "This is my home," I said firmly, staring them down. "And you are not welcome here unless you respect my boundaries. If you can't do that, you need to leave." Their protests filled the air, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to let them see my strength. The shouting started the moment I refused them entry. My father's face was red with anger, his voice booming. "How dare you speak to us this way? We're your parents!" My mother, who had always been the more calculated one, took a softer approach. "Sweetie," she said, her voice quivering just enough to seem sincere, "we're not asking for much. Just a little compassion for your cousin. She's pregnant, for goodness sake. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be." I stood in the doorway, my hands gripping the frame to keep myself steady. The small crowd of relatives behind them, 2 aunts, an uncle, and even one of my cousins, were all whispering amongst themselves, creating a tense chorus of disapproval. "I'm not making this harder," I said, my voice clear and loud enough to cut through the noise. "You are. I've said no, repeatedly, and yet here you are, trying to bully me into changing my mind." "You're being unreasonable," my father barked, stepping closer to the door. "It's just one room. You can't seriously be this selfish." I bit back the wave of anger rising in my chest and took a slow breath. This isn't about the room. This is about respect, and none of you seem to have any for me. Before they could respond, I held up a hand. But since you refuse to listen, let me make myself perfectly clear. I reached inside the door, grabbing the folder I had prepared earlier in the week. I had anticipated this exact scenario and spent hours gathering my documents, determined to stand my ground. Holding the folder up, I fixed my parents with a hard stare. This, I said, pulling out a printed copy of the deed to my house, is a legal document proving that I own this home outright. My name is the only one on it. Not yours, not Olivia's, mine. That means I have every right to decide who lives here and who doesn't. A few relatives exchanged uneasy glances, but my father's jaw tightened. You didn't need to go this far, he muttered, his voice low but seething. I absolutely did, I said firmly, because you refused to take me seriously any other way. I pulled out another sheet of paper. And this, I continued, is a cease and desist letter. It's already signed and ready to be mailed to my lawyer if any of you try to harass me again. If you continue to show up uninvited, call repeatedly, or send people to my home to guilt me into something I've already refused, I will escalate this legally. The color drained from my mother's face. You wouldn't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I would, I said, my gaze unwavering, because I've spent my entire life being the one who bends, the one who sacrifices, the one who gets overlooked while everyone else's needs come first. But that ends now. This is my line in the sand, and I won't let any of you cross it. Olivia, who had been standing quietly behind my parents, finally found her voice. This is ridiculous, she snapped, stepping forward. I'm pregnant, and you're seriously going to turn me away like this? Do you even hear yourself? I turned to her, my voice steady but sharp. Yes, Olivia, I hear myself, and I hear you. You're trying to make your problems my responsibility, and I refuse to let you. Being pregnant doesn't entitle you to someone else's home. She gasped, as though I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. This isn't about family, I continued, looking at everyone on my porch. If it were, you would have respected me enough to accept my no the first time I said it. This is about control, and you've all lost it because I'm finally standing up for myself. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in my life, I saw something flicker in my father's eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe shame, or maybe just shock at the realization that I wasn't backing down. Fine, he said gruffly, stepping back toward the car. If that's how you want to be, we'll leave. My mother tried one last time. Sweetie, please, think about what you're doing. We're your family. And I've thought about it for years, I said, holding her gaze. That's why I know I'm making the right decision. With that, I stepped back inside and closed the door. The sound of their voices faded as I locked it behind me. For a moment, I stood there in the silence, my chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through me. I peered through the window and watched as they argued among themselves before finally driving away. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from relief. For the first time in my life, I felt free. In the days after the showdown, my house felt quieter than ever. At first, I didn't know what to do with the silence. I kept expecting another call, another knock at the door, another attempt to wear me down. But none came. My parents, it seemed, had finally taken me seriously. For the first time in years, I had breathing room. I started filling my days with things I'd put off for far too long. The spare room, which had become a catch-all for clutter, was the first project I tackled. As I cleared it out, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. This room wasn't for Olivia or anyone else. It was mine, and I would decide its purpose. I spent a weekend repainting the walls a soft blue and arranging the furniture to create a reading nook by the window. I lined the bookshelves with my favorite novels, set up a small desk for journaling, and hung a watercolor painting of a serene lake. By the time I finished, the room felt like a retreat, a quiet sanctuary within my larger safe haven. Meanwhile, I started reconnecting with the few family members who had supported me during the chaos. My cousin Sarah, who had defended me in the group chat, invited me out for coffee. "I can't believe how entitled they all were," she said, shaking her head as she stirred her latte. "You handled it better than I would have. I probably would have thrown their suitcases into the street." We both laughed, and for the first time in weeks, the knot of tension in my chest began to loosen. "They've always been like that," I admitted, sipping my tea. "But I guess I didn't realize just how much I'd let it slide until now. It feels good to finally stand up for myself." Sarah nodded. "Well, you deserve peace. And honestly, it's about time they learned they can't push you around." Her words stuck with me. For years, I'd carried the weight of their expectations, letting guilt dictate my choices. Now, that weight was gone, and the relief was indescribable. A week later, my mother called. I stared at her name on the screen, debating whether to answer. Curiosity won out. "Hello?" I said cautiously. There was a long pause before she spoke. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "We shouldn't have pushed you like that." I was stunned. My mother wasn't one to admit fault easily, and for her to offer an apology was nothing short of a miracle. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but you need to understand that my boundaries aren't negotiable. I'm not going to let anyone family or not take advantage of me." "I understand," she said quietly. We thought we were helping Olivia, but I see now that we put too much on you. I'm sorry for that." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. I hung up feeling lighter, as though the final thread tying me to their manipulations had been cut. In the months that followed, I embraced my newfound independence. I joined a book club, started hiking on weekends, and even adopted a rescue dog, a scrappy little mutt named Luna, who quickly became my constant companion. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about Olivia from mutual relatives. She'd moved in with a friend and was figuring things out on her own. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, but it passed quickly. She was an adult, just like me, and it was time for her to take responsibility for her own life. One evening, as I sat in my newly transformed reading room with Luna curled up at my feet, I looked around and felt a deep sense of contentment. For the first time in years, my home truly felt like mine, not just physically, but emotionally. I wasn't the person they could lean on endlessly anymore. I was stronger, freer, and more at peace than I'd ever been. And for that, I had no regrets. Months later, I hosted my first gathering in years. It wasn't the kind of tense family ordeal I'd grown up with. It was a small group of close friends, the people who had cheered me on during the chaos. We sat in my backyard under strings of soft fairy lights, laughing over wine and snacks, Luna trotting between us, happily soaking in the attention. For the first time, I felt what it was like to have a family I chose for myself, one built on mutual respect and support. The spare room became a favorite among my friends, often used as a guest room when someone needed a quiet weekend away. From time to time, my mother called, her tone softer now, less demanding. We were finding a new balance, one where I was no longer the family's crutch. As I watched my friends laugh that night, I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my house, I'd reclaimed my life, and it was better than I'd ever imagined.